All right. Well, with that, we usually here at Keeping It Sacred, we start with a blessing, just honoring the space, being able to have this opportunity to study together. The Jewish prayer for that is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Some people say amen. La'asok means to immerse ourselves, like soak means to soak ourselves, to immerse ourselves. B'divrei means in the words of, and Torah is Torah, but Torah literally means teaching. So we're grateful for this opportunity to study the words of sacred texts, but also the sacred texts of our lives, the teachings of our lives. And today I am so excited to welcome in Dr. Naba Sharif. We have been friends for over 25 years, and she is an allergist. And after Colleyville, she called me in support of the Jewish community, as we are known to do when tragedy strikes either of our communities. And we were talking, we both realized that I was the president of the Interfaith Council of Greater Rancho Santa Margarita, and she happens to serve this year as the Interfaith Chair of the Muslim community of Greater Princeton, New Jersey. So we thought that it was a beautiful coming together, as usual, to honor this holiday of Eid al-Fitr and the sacred day in the Muslim calendar, to be together and explore. So as I said, we met in college. We met in our dorm, Munger Hall at Wellesley College, and we instantly clicked across difference, she being a Muslim from New York and me being Jewish from LA. So you see, Suzanne, that's why I was mentioning it's important that you're from New York. Represent. And we both had fire and drive for leadership, and we both served on our class council that very first year, serving the needs of our dorm. And so we shared the same roof and the same interest in advocating for the people in our community. So today, we are going to talk a bit about our organizing, and our organizing, especially in interfaith spaces, the friendships that can come from that, the authenticity, the authentic relationships that come from that, and the blessing of interfaith community organizing. So I have asked Dr. Sharif to come up with 3 different understandings of interfaith organizing and what messages you have taken from interfaith organizing. I have also come up with 3 thoughts on that. And then after we share, we will open it up for hopefully a robust Q&A opportunity to share. And if there's any questions or things that come up during this, feel welcome to just put it in the chat as we go. No need to hold on to it till the end, but we might address it toward the end. All right. Well, with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Naba Sharif. Thanks for being here.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Heather, for the introduction. As Heather said, she's one of my closest friends, so I'm really excited to be doing this with her and talking about things that are really important to us with all of you. And as she mentioned, it also happens to be the last day of the holy month of Ramadan, which is the Muslim holy month of the year. And this month is a time for reflection, gratitude, and worship. And I can think of no better way to do that today than to be with all of you. But the fact that tomorrow is a holiday is probably why you won't see a lot of people in my community on this webinar today, because everyone's preparing probably meals and traveling across the country to be with their loved ones. But it's recorded, so hopefully they'll get to listen. I'm going to also start off by invoking God. Whenever we start anything, really, anything that we do, we say Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, which means I begin in the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. So I wanted to focus on, as Heather said, 3 insights or reflections when I think about friendships and organizing. And just so you know, I am a physician by trade, as Heather said. I kind of just stumbled upon this role of Interfaith Chair, but I guess there's no coincidences in life, right? So either, I stumbled upon it or it found me somehow. So, but I've had a lot of experience kind of with faith, with members of different faiths my entire life. And one of the reflections that I wanted to talk about was just open-mindedness and curiosity fosters growth. So I grew up in a household where my parents, they would welcome in the Jehovah's Witnesses when they came knocking on our door every year, instead of saying we were busy or pretending we weren't home like a lot of people do. And so I learned early on that in order to understand people, you have to actively listen to them and understand what drives them. And we would literally, call in the Jehovah's Witnesses every year. I mean, I remember that as a thing in my house, where they'd come in and sit for, an hour or two, and my mom would serve them what we called chai or tea and biscuits and, and just talk about our religions. And then in school, elementary school, middle school, high school, I often found myself the subject of curiosity. And I was always explaining myself to my friends or even teachers or my coaches, because so much of my life centered and does center around religion. For example, we pray 5 times a day. And I used to find, I used to pray in my friends' walk-in closets when I used to visit or have sleepovers. Concepts like modesty, because I was an athlete, a year-round athlete. And I always wore long sleeves and leggings underneath my shorts or kilt when I was playing basketball or field hockey or soccer. Or when I was fasting during Ramadan and everyone would take breaks to drink water, but I wouldn't. And I was just constantly looking at my watch about when the fast would break. And I would signal to my coach on the basketball court when I needed to get, have a timeout so that I could quickly, break my fast with oranges or water when sunset hit. And I had a multitude of friends of different faiths. I went to bar and bat mitzvahs throughout middle school. It was such a highlight when I think about it. And that's where, those parties are where I learned how to do the electric slide, the Macarena, it was just such a big part of my middle school memories. We used to go to open houses for churches, synagogues. We invited people to come to our mosque's open house every year. And it was really beautiful just to see how other people lived their faith. And I feel like that contributed a lot to me, just not living in a closed ecosystem or an echo chamber, as many people often do. Which brings me to my second reflection, which is it's okay to be uncomfortable. And I have 3 examples of this, and all 3 of these actually include Heather.
No.
The great thing about our friendship is that it blossomed at a time that we were solidifying our identities in college. We went to Wellesley College, as she mentioned. And as she mentioned, we became friends through leadership and in class council. It was actually the entire class. I think you said dorm. But it was actually the class of 2001. We were, it was the entire class, and also a love of hip hop. And so we didn't really necessarily bond in the first place because of anything to do with religion. It really was just because we got along really well and we clicked. But when things got uncomfortable for us at times, we were always there for each other. And so I have 3 examples of this where I was uncomfortable. And my first example is shortly after I started wearing hijab, or this scarf on my head full time, in my junior year of college. And I had an uncomfortable experience at the mall. I went to the mall and an old lady repeatedly kept asking me where I was from, and she wouldn't take New York as my answer. And it was really upsetting to me as someone who had just started wearing the hijab, being questioned about my Americanness. And Heather was the person that I talked to after I got home, who gave me space to sort through all the emotions that I was feeling and helped me feel really more grounded when I felt very vulnerable. The second example I had was when I was, again, shortly after I started wearing hijab, probably within the first month or 2, I was considering going to a college party on campus. And I felt uncomfortable because I really wanted to go, but I felt like I wasn't dressed up for the party with hijab, and I couldn't reconcile it with myself. So Heather came over and we figured out a style that was authentic to the experience. And to this day, we laugh about it. We call it the Erykah Badu style, because it was all tied up, and I wore these hoop earrings, and it wasn't like this, but it was still authentic kind of to me and to the experience. And the last example is when I was in my pediatrics residency, and I was selected to go on a trip to Israel to teach high school kids, Israeli kids, Palestinian kids, and Jordanian kids about the heart. And it was a really difficult decision about whether to go, both because I was worried about how I would potentially be discriminated against being such a visible Muslim in Israel, and everything that I had basically, seen and heard about in the media. But also because I was wondering about whether by going, I was supporting, whether I was supporting a movement that may have supported human rights violations against Palestinians, which is a big concern of mine. So I did a lot of research, and I called Heather, and we talked through a lot of things, and she did some research for me as well. And ultimately I did decide to go. And it was a very harrowing experience, particularly at the airport. It was probably one of the worst and most fearful experiences of my life, at the airport, and also with the military checkpoints. The program was based in Ein Gedi, which is kind of in the south. But I went to both Nazareth and Jerusalem, and it was terrifying just because I'd never seen so many weapons, and the checkpoints where they would take our passports, and it seemed like forever. And I was wondering whether I was going to get them back, or what was going to happen to me. So it was very fearful. But the time that I spent with the kids in the camp, and learning about their struggles, their pain, and really their innocence in many ways, as teenagers, experiencing conflict firsthand, was something that I will never forget, and it will stay with me. And I'm so glad that I went. And so that uncomfortability that I had was worth it, because I gained so much in return. And so the last insight or reflection that I wanted to talk about was to invest in social capital, and don't always look at ROI, which is return on investment, which is a concept that we don't really think about in medicine. But my husband, who's more of a economics person, we always talk about ROI. But as Heather said, the friendship that we've had, has now spanned over 25 years. And like I said, it was just based on clicking of personalities and really nothing else. We weren't like, what are we going to gain from each other? Or, 25 years later, are we going to be helping each other out in our interfaith communities? But I look at it now, and it's amazing. It's really been such a fulfilling friendship, an uplifting friendship. And a lot of times we invest in things or people or organizations or movements thinking like, how is this going to help me? How is this going to benefit me now? But the reality is that the ROI comes from simply investing in people sincerely. And she talked about Colleyville, but shortly after college, 9/11 hit, and Heather stood in solidarity with our community. And I remember visiting her in New York City, and she was just so super conscious about my feeling safe, keeping me safe and making sure that I felt safe. And a few years ago, when some of you may remember, there was a Jewish cemetery in Philly that was desecrated. Our Muslim community actually raised over $150,000 to repair the tombstones. And then, as she mentioned in Colleyville, hostages were taken. I wanted to make sure that Heather, again, knew that our community stood in solidarity with hers, as did really every other Muslim community that I knew. And this is how we support each other. This is how we've been supporting each other. This is how I can say I've personally benefited so much from our friendship. I know Heather is a part of my tribe. And I know whatever community she's a part of, or will be a part of, she will support me. And whatever community I'm a part of, I will do the same. And that means everything to me. So those are my short reflections on our friendship and organizing and really interfaith work that I've had.
So kind, and I right back at you. I mean, I feel so much appreciation for who you are, and the way that you just, welcome people and take people for who they are, and have always welcomed me and appreciated me. And coming out to you never felt like a problem or a question. It was just like, I can be my authentic self. We both play basketball. We bond over that. And we could, just accept each other for who we are and keep supporting each other. It's such a privilege to see you, blossom, into your, medical practice. Dr. Sharif, Naba has saved my kid's life, actually, almost pretty literally. Ironically, we were on a trip to Israel, my youngest son, who's 5 now, but he was 3 at the time. And he had a bad reaction to some medicine, and he started getting all these welts everywhere, and we had to take him to a hospital the night before our flight. And I called Naba up, and you took my call right away and helped me kind of understand what was going on. And there was like a translation thing with the doctors at the hospital, and just really helped me know what questions to ask and how to approach the situation as a mom and from a medical perspective. And
get the right prescriptions from the pharmacy.
I know, yeah, to get the right prescriptions, the right dose, to tell me what to watch for on the plane ride back, because we'd be, in the air for 11 hours. I wouldn't be able to call like you, and that was like 3 a.m. where I was. So I think it was like 8 o'clock at night where you were, but really, really talk about the benefits. I mean, but obviously we don't do this for the benefits. We're not like thinking one day she's going to save my kid's life. We're thinking like we enjoy each other's company. So that kind of brings me to the 3 thoughts that I had on interfaith organizing and interfaith communities. One is the beauty lives everywhere. It really, truly does, right? I grew up in an interfaith family, and my grandmother had a Christmas tree, and on that Christmas tree, she's Unitarian. And so Unitarians really do welcome in the beauty of multiple traditions. And on her Christmas tree, she always had ornaments from all over the world. And you could tell that there was like a genuine appreciation for different cultures and different ways of approaching the world. And at her church, she would have us as little kids pin mittens on the Christmas tree to give to the poor in Washington, D.C. for the cold winters. And so that experience made me realize like everybody's trying to do a mitzvah. Like from my perspective in Judaism, it's a mitzvah. It's a good deed. It's something that helps the community and lifts the community up. And it's beautiful as well. So for them to do that, there's so much beauty everywhere. My cousins were always telling me what was important to them about their religious traditions. They would ask me about mine, and I'd have the opportunity, like you said, Naba, to represent and to understand and feel the privilege of that and the responsibility of that. To show how beauty lives everywhere, even if you don't necessarily have all the resources to show the beauty. Like one time at space camp, I was the only, there were 3 Jews in the space camp, and it was going to be Shabbat in our artificial space. So they wanted to see like what it would be like to celebrate Shabbat. And it was the most pathetic Shabbat because you can't burn candles in space. So we had to have electric candles, but of course they didn't have any electric candles. They didn't have challah because we were in Huntsville, Alabama, and the counselor didn't know what that was. We had white bread, and they certainly didn't have grape juice or wine because we were underage. So we had Coca-Cola, and it was probably the most pathetic Shabbat sanctification. But there's that responsibility to share the beauty of your tradition. And within every tradition, there is so much beauty. So to always look for that. I've studied the Quran and Muslim teachings. And, there's always those moments when you're like, I wish our people would have written that. Like, because it's so beautiful. And that's wonderful to just have that kind of appreciation with everything. It's and actually when I was enrolled in the Introduction to Islam class, I don't know if you remember this, Naba, but I had a Quran that the teacher had on the reading list, and you're like, oh no, not that one. You got to read this one, right? Because we all have different versions of it. So that was, and there is so much beauty everywhere, and perspectives and wisdom, because our traditions are so old. So that's the first thing, that beauty really lives everywhere. The second thing was about don't make assumptions, right? Whenever we engage across interfaith lines, and this goes for everyone, right? To not make assumptions. One of my earliest experiences of the Muslim community was really of a Jewish person's perspective of the Muslim community when Yitzhak Rabin was killed. At the time, I was going to a Jewish day school, and one of the kids in my class said expletive Arabs, and he immediately assumed that it was like a Muslim fundamentalist who killed Rabin, right? And without missing a beat, my rabbi, who was in the classroom and overheard him say that, she's like, what are you talking about? That was a Jewish person who killed Rabin, right? Like, to make, when people make those assumptions about what happens, and who's behind what, and what people are going to think, what assumptions and thoughts we make about what they think about feminism or the LGBT community or politics or Israel, that we really lose something there, that, we can't make those kinds of assumptions. It's not fair to other people, and it's oftentimes inaccurate. To also not make assumptions that there's only one way of being Muslim, or one way of being Jewish, or one way of being anything, right? In all faiths, there is a spectrum from universalist to particularist, fundamentalist. There's lots of different ways to approach tradition. Some people are more ritually involved. Some people are more involved in social justice. To always remember that just as in your own tradition, that there's variance, there's also variance in other traditions. So it's important to kind of have a broad perspective and to know the different thoughts. And that's why it was so great when you gave me that Quran, because you're like, there is that Quran translation, but there's also this one. So seeing deeper, Rabbi Meir in Pirkei Avot from the year 200, he says to not only look at the bottle, but what is therein, right? So always going deeper than surface level. That's like a rabbinic way of saying, don't judge a book by its cover. That was before they create, books weren't invented till 1500. So this is a little earlier. All they had were bottles. So not making assumptions. And the third thing that I've really learned was about the power of building power stronger, that we are stronger together, and that it's necessary, and that there's an amazing solidarity that you can form with people across difference that surprises people, that delights people, right? From the unlikely allies challenging each other. Unlikely allies bonding together to challenge something that's difficult for their own community, and how we really are so beneficial to each other's communities. I can think of the opportunities of school districts and holiday observance for the Jewish community. There happens almost every year. I get calls about picture days on Yom Kippur. Like, what? And when the Muslim community leaders locally support us and say, hey, we got to think about all religious holidays, and at least like the most sacred ones. Let's just, support each other in that's like, there's so much to be gained there. I know that on campus at Wellesley, there was halal and kashrut food in one dorm together, because we had organized together and united over that and been able to kind of create that ability. I know that there was a time in college also when the head of houses wanted to celebrate the dorm heads or whatever, like the student leaders in the dorms, with a celebratory brunch. Great idea. But it was on Ramadan. So I was like, hey, why don't you just do it for a dinner instead, or just do it next month? And there was a bit of resistance, but the point is that, we can build together, and we can recognize, in the moment, the administrator said to me, well, they don't have to eat. And I was like, have you ever fasted and been around food? Because it is not easy. And if you're trying to honor people and you then put them in that situation, that's not honoring. So just being able to kind of support each other and understand where each other's coming from. And, after the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand of a mosque, myself and the Interfaith Council of Greater Rancho Santa Margarita immediately went over to the mosque to bring flowers and to stand by so that the people who are coming in to pray for the daily prayers, for the Friday afternoon prayer, would feel welcome and to know that the interfaith community was standing in solidarity and that we would be there with them, that we wouldn't be fearful about going there, right? After the Tree of Life shooting, we had 200 interfaith community members at our doorstep, at our synagogue as well. So just being able to kind of recreate the sacred space and hold sacred space for each other is spiritually, emotionally, sometimes physically, and definitely mentally very nurturing and supporting. So just understanding that we can really build that power together and encourage each other's flourishing. So we have shared some of our different understandings of interfaith organizing and the benefits of them and the approaches that we each take. Now it's time for you to share. If you have any questions or thoughts, if this brought up anything for you or anything that's challenging for you, I'd like to open up the floor. We can start with Jessica, if Jessica, you're okay with that, because you're writing a paper on women's interfaith organizing, right?
Yes.
Would you like to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my dissertation is on the motivations, experiences, and contributions of women and non-binary folks in interfaith spaces. And those interfaith spaces are divided between like institutional spaces, so like interfaith councils, but then also organic spaces like friendships and homes and dorms. And so, yeah, so I'm going to just say, so I'm Mormon. And I believe in personal revelation. And I was randomly, so I'm fasting today because today is our normal fast day. We fast once a month on Sunday. And I thought it was a beautiful connection that our fast day is also the last day of Ramadan. So there's that. And then, so I was like, okay, what am I going to do today? Like when I get home to like center my fast and to just, I don't know. So I like randomly went on Facebook, which is probably not the best choice, but it also was the best choice because it was like 5 minutes before this thing was starting. And I was like, yes, this is what I am doing. So divine intervention. So that's like my background story. And I think something that I thought was really powerful about what you both shared is at the beginning, I think, Naba, you said like, you kind of created this relationship and religion wasn't necessarily part of the motivating relationship building. It was all these other parts of your identities. And something that I've found in my research with the 59 people that I've interviewed is that like their friendships, even though religion isn't like you don't walk into a space and you're all like, hey, I'm Muslim, I'm Jewish, I'm Mormon, let's have a relationship. But like, obviously those values and the things that you care about are there. And I feel like there's like almost like a soul to soul connection. Like you're like, oh, let's be friends based on basketball or friends based on like the music that we like. But there's like an underlying like value system that like allows that relationship to flourish. So that was a thought. And then something else that you both brought up, and I think Naba, you brought it up because you went to Israel. And this is something that I am struggling with in my research. So maybe you both can comment on this. Is that in institutional spaces, so like an interfaith council is not going to talk about Israel-Palestine situations. They're just not going to touch it. But in these like organic like friendships, like over text message or through phone conversations or crying on each other's couches, you can have these hard conversations of like, our communities don't see eye to eye, or our community, or like, I have this personal experience and you have another personal experience, and but I love you and let's like work through it. And I find that that's something that's really powerful and important. And so I don't know if either of you want to speak to that, about like the hard conversations, especially like Israel and Palestine. A little bit more background. Over in June, when there was the last like really big attack in Palestine, a lot of my like Muslim friends reached out to me that they were so sad that like their friends in the interfaith communities of all faiths, like no one responded. And one person in particular said to me, like, she thinks that it's because they didn't want to also, while they're supporting their Muslim friends, they also didn't want to at the same time offend their Jewish friends. And so the interfaith councils as a whole and individuals made a choice that kind of ostracized certain people. And that was really hard for my heart. But I also don't have a lot of stake in that game. So if either of you want to speak to that really hard question.
Sure. Would you like to, or would you like me to start, or?
You can start, Heather.
Okay. So, I was thinking a bit about what you were saying again, Naba, about like representing your people, right? Especially in interfaith spaces, there's like a pressure to represent your people, right? Like, I'm not only the Jewish person in the world, but amongst this interfaith councilman, I'm the only Jew in the room. Right now, I'm the representative of all Jewish people, right? So when you bring up Israel, what I say is now going to be seen, like, could be magnified, that right, like to that level. And that's like a lot of pressure, given that there is such a broad spectrum, right, of what's happening. But when you're sitting on someone's couch, you're you and they're them. And like, you can talk through, right, what's going on. I think also in some of those spaces, it's important that your friends understand that you can hear what's underneath. So like, if someone was, if two people were really opposite on any geopolitical situation like Israel, and some of their spirituality was tied up in that, and some of their understanding about human rights was tied into that, and some of their understanding about safety was tied up in that, and fear, which all of those layers are in that conversation. That when you're one-on-one with a friend, you have the opportunity to focus on that person, to understand the context of everywhere where they're coming from, and to kind of get under the issue, so that even if a person was on the opposite side of the issue, you can at least start seeing the issue through their experience and their eyes. And that's really where kind of the bonding happens. I talk about this with my premarital counseling couples as well, right? That when two people come to an issue and they're like, how could you possibly want pizza for dinner? Well, how could you possibly not want it? It's like, well, pizza is something that I ate with my grandma, so I have good feelings about it. Okay, I understand that. Or pizza is the thing that I used to eat with my ex-boyfriend. He used to love it. So of course I'm not going to like it. Okay, now I understand where you're coming from, right? Like, when you get under issues, which you can do in one-on-one situations, and that's obviously a funny example, but when we're talking about geopolitics and the multi-dimensions of those, the goal is to kind of get under it and to understand. We might not the goal isn't to like convert you to my way of thinking, or you to, but the goal is to understand how a person would have that kind of understanding and appreciate where they're coming from with it, and given their experience. Now, in the process of revealing that, people might change their opinions. They might understand differently, and opening might open up to think about the issue differently, which is also a beautiful thing. But I agree. There's a lot of frustration that I have, Jessica, as you're mentioning, around like, first the assumption that a human rights abuse against Palestinians wouldn't be a Jewish concern, or something that a Jewish community would want to. And of course there are some that wouldn't, right? But so like, so it's part of it is those assumptions. Part of it is just the pressure that there is to like make an official statement and cause a firestorm, and then create this like, cancel culture stuff, right? How do we call each other in instead of calling each other out? And being able, at the very least, like our Interfaith Council has done, which is create a statement of values to recognize the beauty and honor of every human being, to understand that interfaith communities are important, and that we stand for human dignity across spectrums. And, you know, even for communities that have negative understandings of the LGBT community, for example, our interfaith statement includes the LGBTQ community, right? So we can appreciate that, you know, even if different ways are not the ways that we comport ourselves in the world, that everyone still has the right to live and thrive as they are meant to, as they deem appropriate for themselves too. So that's how I kind of approach that question. But I share that frustration of, you know, just because you're supporting the Palestinian community doesn't mean you're, you know, that's bad for the Jews by necessity. Like, yeah.
Yeah, that was very comprehensive, Heather. I agreed with a lot of what you said, and Jessica, I completely also share the frustration that you mentioned as well. And like Heather was saying, I think you know, even in just your initial you know, reflections where you said don't make assumptions, I think that's such a big thing, you know, and you ended with that now too. Yeah, like I think that it's very common for people to feel like, oh, all Muslims feel this way and all Jews feel this way about Israel and Palestine. And that's so not true, right? Like, I mean, you know, politics and religion are so, can be so different from one another in some ways, you know? And I think it's important to share, to focus on the shared values, like you said, like, you know, can we agree that like we all respect human dignity? Can we agree that there may be violations, you know, human rights violations taking place, and that would be wrong, right? Those things, I think, you know, we can agree on. I mean, the politics behind that, I think there's obviously a lot of disagreement on. I think how to quote unquote solve it, I think there's a lot of disagreement on, of course. But I think if we focus on, you know, exactly what you said, Heather, like why people might feel the way that they do, and what those feelings are, the fear, you know, the concern, safety issues, you know, basic human rights issues, you know, which, like I said, I witnessed firsthand when I was there, and it was terrifying for me as an outsider to see that this is kind of just a glimpse of what people may be going through on a daily basis. It was really eye-opening. But I also saw it through the lens of, you know, the teenagers that I spoke to, right? And the program that I went on, it was really an amazing program because we went there to teach about science, right? Like about the heart, literally cardiovascular physiology, that's what it was. But it was really a twofold program. Like we were there as the academics, you know, physicians teaching these kids who were gifted and talented. But the program brought together actually Palestinians as well and Jordanians as well as Israeli teenagers. And they were all 16. They were 16-year-old kids. And the Israeli kids were about to join the army the following year, you know. And the Palestinian and the Jordanian kids were just like living in just terrible circumstances, especially the Palestinians, of course. And they would talk about it because they'd really never met, almost all of them had never actually met other people, you know, people of the other side, I would say. And it was fascinating. The Israeli kids that I spoke to, you know, many of them didn't want to join the army, right? And that was really interesting. That was really, really interesting for me to talk to these kids. You know, they're like, it's just what we kind of have to do, you know, kind of like a rite of passage. Every kid has to do it. But we don't really want to be holding guns and we don't want to be doing these things, you know? And I think that was really important for the Palestinians to actually hear, right? Like this is a political issue, but it's not really, you know, when you talk to people about it, right? Like the actual people, they might actually have a really different opinion about it. I thought that was really fascinating. But going back to the program, so the other half of the program that that was there were conflict resolution counselors and people that were involved in social work that were also there, that were the half of the day was spent actually, aside from the scientific portion, half of the day was actually spent getting these kids in rooms and talking about their families and the struggles and shared values and their fears and their hopes and their dreams. And I think once they left the program, I think they had a very different understanding of people on the other side of the conflict than when they had never actually spoken and made all these assumptions about the other side. And I thought it was very humanizing, and it was very heartening, actually, in a lot of ways to see. And that kind of model, in some ways, is something that, you know, would be helpful in a lot of other spaces, right? If we just got, just like Heather was saying, and what you were saying, Jessica, like on a couch and talking, but even in a more formal setting, to talk about things in that type of atmosphere where we're just talking about our fears, you know, and what we want and what we wish for, and not just the politics of it all, we would realize that actually there's a lot in common, right? There's a lot in common with what we want. It may not pan out in terms of the politics, but the shared values are actually would potentially bring us closer together. I don't know, that's a long-winded answer for your question, but I thought it was, you know, like I said, the program was really eye-opening for me in that way. And I wish we had more opportunities to do that. But a lot of it was just on not making assumptions and recognizing that everybody has a thought on the conflict, but that's based on their own experiences and based on their own, I don't know, their own experiences and their own like desires and fears, you know?
So we share that common, like, human experience and human desire for, you know,
wellness and safety and security and peace and all of those things.
And isn't it, it's also so odd to inherit this legacy of hatred. I think that's also like a really hard thing to face, is like, Naba and I wouldn't normally talk about Israel. It's like we're busy building like the world that should have existed in the first place, and not like cleaning up the hatred that was spilled by generations past. Mm-hmm. And so, like, you know, in part of interfaith organizing, you have to be really balanced to both, you know, help address some of that hatred, like when there are shootings in sacred spaces and like things like that. We do have to have that reactive approach to the sadness, and also to have a proactive approach to that hatred by doing these kinds of programs of community dialogue, but also just to like appreciate and celebrate one another and just build the relationship that should have been in the first place. So interfaith organizing can kind of take many different forms. Like we have an interfaith musical celebration coming up on June 12th that will bring together musical traditions of so many faiths. And, you know, that's going to just be a beautiful celebration and recognition of the depth of various traditions and people being able to come to it. So, you know, it's hard to have to like inherit that heaviness.
Mm-hmm. And I think one other thing I was going to mention is it's also sometimes hard to like be critical and be told that being critical is anti-Semitic, for example, right? And I always was very heartened by talking to people like Heather, like you, Heather, right? Mm-hmm. And because you clearly recognize, right, that your criticism or of any particular part of that conflict, I mean, you're Jewish, you're not anti-Semitic, obviously. So you recognize that. So when you say anything, it would be fine, right? But me saying the same thing might be taken completely differently. Yeah. And so it's always very heartening to have those conversations with people like you, because you understand that there's so much nuance right there. And you mentioned cancel culture before, but like, talking about this is not, it is very, can be very volatile, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, right? If we can be really just thoughtful in how we talk about it. And the words that we used, we talked about that earlier. The words that we use are important in how we talk about it. But I thought that was really important. Like, we can be critical without being anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim or, or pro-terrorism or whatever, right? Like, it's not like these black and white concepts that people sometimes make it out to be.
Totally. And not to say that I'd have immunity, even as a rabbi, from being called anti-Semitic. That's the other thing, is that like, even in the, some Jews in the progressive community are still questioned as far as, their Jewish loyalty. Even as a rabbi, even as a Jewish professional, there were several rabbinical students who recently came out and said something about Israel, and they weren't called anti-Semitic by the Reform world, but I'm sure some people in other communities would have called them that because of their criticism of Israel and the treatment of Palestinians. And so like, that's the other thing. I think that's also like, thinking through who you allow to muzzle you and who you don't, and how do you actually stand for the flourishing of human beings on the planet, and also how can you become accountable as well, right? So much is being done in my name. Before I went to rabbinical school for a year in Israel, I actually recorded a video that in the case of my death, that people should play, that said, if I died, even if it was a, suicide bomber, do not use the death of this, white Jewish woman who's a rabbinical student to perpetuate violence against a whole community of people, right? Like, I actually recorded something before I left and gave it to my brother, and just to make sure that, like, so much is being done in our names that it's that inheriting that heaviness that's just, I don't want anything to do with that. Yeah. Anyway, thanks, Jessica, for raising all of these. You have a follow-up that you have?
Yeah, I was just going to say, because you brought up so we have the word conflict and we have the word critical, and also with Rabbi Heather reflecting on like how you're even seen within your own community. Like, for me, like in Mormon circles, I've been told that I'm like apostate. People have been concerned for my salvation because of some of the critical positions that I hold. And the thing that for me, like, interfaith gives me kind of the confidence to be more critical and to enter into, how do I say this? So conflict is natural. Like, people have conflict all the time. Like you were talking about, like, husbands and wives and partners have conflict, and kids and parents have conflict. Like, conflict's natural, but like sticking in it or staying in it is like the problem. And a lot of times when I'm critical in my spaces, there's this really great phrase that Mormons love to overuse, and it says, contention is of the devil. So if someone raises a critical comment or enters into a conflict, people, to shut you up, they'll just say, contention's of the devil, just stop. And I'm like, but that's not what I'm doing. I'm not being contentious. Mm-hmm. I'm raising a concern, and I'm entering into this space because I want it to get better, and I don't want it to rise to the level of contention. And so both of your comments just made me think of that, and like helped me kind of formulate that thought. So thank you.
I would like to add to that.
Sure.
I see. I come from a Protestant Christian tradition, and I see a huge capacity for complicity with cruelty within my tradition. And Jessica, when you mentioned, and I'm sorry, there was something going on in my room, so I couldn't hear the event you mentioned. Some bad event happened against a Muslim community, and they didn't hear compassion expressed by the Christian, or vice versa. I'm sorry, I didn't catch which event you were talking about, but I'm sure there've been many such events over history. And to me, that's a capacity for cruelty, passive cruelty on the part of the Christian friends that aren't going and saying, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry that the synagogue got bombed," or whatever it was, or this mosque got defaced, or whatever it was that happened. That when people go silent, to me, that shows a passive capacity for complicity with cruelty. On the other side of my culture is an active capacity for complicity with cruelty, and that are the comments that people who do try to stand up for what's right or try to show compassion, they get put down comments from other members of the same community, such as what you were getting, that maybe you were being contentious or something like that. And no, you were just bringing up some uncomfortable thing about some meanness or something that's happening in your community that is an opportunity to change. You weren't being contentious. So I sort of see the on one half having a passive capacity for cruelty, and on the flip side, sort of the loud grandmothers being silenced, and that's sort of an active capacity or pressuring against people who stand up for compassion to go off back into the shadows and not show the younger generation how to show that compassion. So we really have to address that from both sides of the problem.
Well said. And that's why having an interfaith council is so great, because we can help stand in solidarity with each other as well on that. And yeah, I mean, in the Jewish community, I've seen the Black community saying, like, how come no one's standing up and talking about this issue, police violence, or, this synagogue attack. And, everyone's so quick to say something about this community when they get attacked. But when it's ours, there's radio silence, that's just, it's just a sad experience. And like you said, like that silence can be violence, or experienced as violence, certainly. And there is so much tragedy in the world too. The other thing I would say about the contentious discussion is, in Judaism, we have a concept of that. It's called machloket l'shem shamayim, which means a disagreement for the sake of heaven. Right? We all know when you have a disagreement for the sake of heaven to try and get to a higher place with each other, that's a holy endeavor, actually. And that actually builds up the community, right? That's why the rabbis argue with each other all the time in the Talmud and other places, right? It's machloket l'shem shamayim. It's a disagreement for the sake of heaven. And we also know what it feels like when there's a disagreement for the sake of tearing each other down and for the sake of destruction. And so when we do this, and what's really hard is when you try and do a machloket l'shem shamayim, trying to give rebuke for the sake of love, or perspective for the sake of providing another idea, that when someone takes that as you're trying to tear down, that's really hard. So, and that happens a lot, and it's definitely something to contend with. Sandy, I want to get to you before we close. We have a hard stop at 1 Pacific. But yeah, hi, Sandy, so great to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I don't know if you kind of like answered this already, because I know that we're like, okay, it's important to have conflict and have these conversations. But I was like thinking, how do you encourage peacemaking instead of like peacekeeping in interfaith spaces? Because I feel like it's so easy to just be like, let's just keep the peace, like everybody just love one another. I was like, that's not really helpful if we're not getting to like the root of the problem. And then we're just all going to pretend like everything's okay. And also, I guess that kind of in relation to these like politics that are at work within these institutions, I feel like I personally have a very hard time navigating these, whether it's respectability politics or trying to be like I don't know if diplomatic is the right word, but I guess like a lot of people will sometimes beat around the bush for like the sake of respectability. I am not that person. Like I'm just like, people are gonna get offended. Like it is what it is. And so it's kind of hard for me to like tone it down. So it's like, how do you address the politics that work within these spaces? Like I guess I think there's a Christian saying that says something about as gentle as doves and like as wise as serpents or something like that. Like basically how are we gentle with people and also realize that like there's like a greater like we need to move towards something greater together, if that makes sense.
Totally. Naba, do you want to jump in there, or
You probably have more experience with that, Heather, so I would leave it to you.
Yeah, I just think like this is why I'm so involved in, like I believe, like Naba said, it's like the long-term relationships. Like I don't want to just like come in on an issue and then leave and then like never see you again, right? I want to make sure that we're in constant dialogue, and we're in dialogue about not only this but other things, so that we have, again, when we have like those structures of understanding who a person is holistically, then, there's a lot more trust. There's a lot more elasticity of the relationship. So like you can, we have a very strong bond, so I can push you even more and you can push me even more. We are not afraid that the relationship's going to break. So as a religious and spiritual leader, like it's important for me to create these opportunities for dialogue and for interaction. And right in the progressive world, we say proximity. That's everything, right? To be proximate with each other and to understand each other's lives. So that's why it is important. Yes, I've been to 800 million iftars, and I'm going to keep going because it's important to be proximate and to be in relationship with people. We have amazing discussions over dinner, and it's important symbolically, but it's also important very practically to understand and, to pray for each other's parents or people when they're ill, and, to understand, to talk about the school systems and, what our kids are facing. It's all important. I don't know if you have anything to add there, but.
No, I was going to say, you talked about the school holidays. One thing that came up when I moved to this community in Greater Princeton in New Jersey was, the mosque that I'm the Interfaith Chair for. It was just built a few years ago, and there was a lot of opposition to the mosque, which happens in communities everywhere, actually, to the zoning board, right? They would have these meetings, and there was quite a bit of opposition. And it was really the interfaith community that stood by us. And this was, again, before I joined this community, but I still say us because I'm now part of this community, but stood by the community and said, no, this is a great use for this space. This is the best use for this space, and we want this to happen. And I think, and this speaks to your earlier point, Heather, about like power and there's power and strength in building the relationships. But that was another kind of powerful moment where we recognize that like this is not just like, fluffy talk, right? This is, we're actually truly standing by each other's community in times of tangible need. Like our community in this area needed a space, and I actually think it was a member of the synagogue, of one of the synagogues, that actually stood up and actually made a case that was like, quoted for now several years now about why the mosque was the best use of the space that was there, and the opposition had no justification really for opposing. And so again, that is, I think, finding out what each community really needs and trying to support the community in what they actually need is a way to not make it just fluffy talk about like, we all love each other. We just, right.
Awesome on this.
Exactly. But stand with each other and support each other in things that are needed.
And it deepens the relationship. Well, I'm just going to add this on like our necklace of like charms of our, shared friendship over time of just this experience has just been such a jewel and such a gem of a discussion. And I so appreciate you coming on, Dr. Naba Sharif. And thank you all for your wonderful questions and perspectives and observations. We did record this, I apologize again for the time change. Thank you all for toggling. Or for the divine intervention for Jessica to be able to be here. Not that I'm blaming it on that. Good job. But thank you so much for anyone who was signed up, who's just hearing the recording. If you have follow-up questions or thoughts, Naba and I will be very glad to take those. So just email me at rabbimiller@keepingitsacred.com. And we're very sorry that you had to miss it, and hope to see everyone again soon. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.